All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for everyone for waiting, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar names in the participant list. Thank you so much for joining us. So we're very pleased to share with you research on water sanitation and hygiene in Ghana, Uganda, and Zambia. The webinar is being convened by American National Standards Institute, the United States Agency for International Development, the Center for Water Security and Cooperation, and the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials. My name is Atiya Sayed, and I manage the WASH portfolio at ANSI as part of our Standards Alliance Phase 2 project. So over the next hour and a half, we'll be discussing the newly released WASH report with the authors CWSC and IATMO. Firstly, if you haven't yet downloaded the report, please refer to the chat box. I'm going to drop in the link so that you have that with you. And we'll be sending out the report and the slides after the presentation. And just so you are aware, this webinar is being recorded. So next slide, please. And firstly, I'd like to introduce ANSI, the Standards Alliance Phase 2, and share a little bit more about why standards matter in the WASH sector. So standards play a pivotal role in ensuring the quality, safety, and reliability of water and sanitation services by providing guidelines for infrastructure, processes, and products. They serve as benchmarks for the performance and capabilities and facilitate effective management innovation and address international cooperation in addressing WASH challenges. USAID is a leading development organization dedicated to promoting economic and social development worldwide. On the call with us today is Daniel Vasquez, the Senior Standards Specialist at USAID, who has worked with us tirelessly on the project. So to that end, ANSI and USAID operate a global development alliance for the Standards Alliance Phase 2, which goes beyond WASH. Together with our partners, we operate projects focused on ANSI's area of expertise, which includes standards, conformity assessment, good regulatory practices, and national quality infrastructure, which we'll be hearing about today. We work with a variety of stakeholders, including companies, standards developing organizations, and professional societies, all towards promoting the good work of standards and their implementations. Next slide, please. So Standards Alliance Phase 2 operates globally, and you can learn more about the projects on our website. We've been working with CWSC and IATMO on WASH National Quality Infrastructure for the past 2 years, and together we're excited to share the findings and recommendations with you. So now I'll turn it over to Christopher.
Thanks, Atiya. We appreciate USAID and ANSI for supporting this project through the Standards Alliance. Good morning to everyone joining us from Washington, D.C. My name is Christopher Lindsay, and I'm the Vice President of Government Relations for the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials. Now, you can imagine with a name that long, we often are known by our acronym, IATMO. IATMO is a nearly 100-year-old trade association that's an important voice for the plumbing, water, and sanitation industries. With offices in 13 countries around the globe, IATMO frequently works with national and provincial stakeholders on governance issues related to products, personnel, and systems in our sector. We believe that sustainable water and sanitation services can only be achieved when there's a strong local industry to support it. So we were excited to serve as a collaborator on the Plumbing the Depths report and are looking forward to discussing the key findings and recommendations from the report with you today. I appreciate each of you taking time out of your busy schedules to join us in this discussion. As we looked at the list of the registrants for today's webinar, I was impressed by the diversity of organizations and government state agencies that are represented and by the depth of experience on WASH systems and governance that we have. With that, I'll pass the mic to Alexandra, who is the principal investigator on this report.
Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you so much, Atiya and Christopher. It's been such an honor to be able to work with both of you on this project and an exciting 2 years doing this research. My name is Alexandra Campbell-Ferrari, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Water Security and Cooperation. We're a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to ensuring that law and practice guarantee water security and universal access to water and sanitation. And you'll get a taste of what that looks like as I start the presentation. So I will jump right into things. So the purpose of this research was to understand whether or not there was a strong NQI wash in Ghana, Uganda, and Zambia, and specifically focusing on the law and standard side. So we were looking to determine whether or not existing national level laws and standards sufficiently enable greater access to water and sanitation services, and then also ensure that those services and technologies are both safe and reliable. So there's those two components. So focusing on the national level laws and standards and ensuring that they create that enabling environment for greater access to water and sanitation, but then also making sure that there are those standards and regulations in place to ensure that when there are those services and technologies, that they're actually providing a safe and reliable service for those customers. So what is NQI WASH? NQI obviously is a term that you've most likely heard of, National Quality Infrastructure. The NQI WASH is something we kind of coined as we kept talking about this, since we're focusing on water, sanitation, and hygiene. And for us, we focused on the law and regulation side. So we were looking to make sure that the laws and regulations create that need for WASH products and services, and the standards that not only create the need for those technologies and products, but ensure that they're safe. So again, that dual kind of component there, that you have the services and that when you then have the services, they're actually safe and keeping you protected. So a strong NQI WASH, what we would anticipate being in place are good laws, strong institutions, and clear standards, clear and comprehensive standards that both increase access to those services and technologies, and like I said earlier, make sure that those standards and those services and technologies are safe for public health and the environment.
And I'll just jump in here just to spend a moment on the standards and national technical regulations. We believe that there is a link between strong water governance and resilient and sustainable systems. And so as we look to make universal access to WASH a reality, there has to be a strong local industry to support it. And so we do this by helping governments institutionalize processes through standards or technical regulations that first establish frameworks for how water and sanitation systems should be constructed and organized, from rural on-site systems to larger commercial systems. And this includes identifying the skilled labor and products that these systems require. Second, there's a need to elevate and diversify the work of local labor, adopting systems that recognize, teach, and value specific skill sets. And then finally, another key portion of this is developing reliable supply chains, basically encouraging local manufacturing and distribution, the free exchange of safe products across borders, and ensuring that products are available to the end of the last mile. While today's report provides some wonderful insights into the laws and regulations and institutions that exist in each of these countries, I think I'll be paying particular attention to those standards and technical regulations around products, as I believe they are kind of the lowest hanging fruit and the easiest to begin with to take action, and the easiest entry point to take action.
And Christopher, I appreciate where you started in terms of that focus on the realization. I think that, it sometimes feels like, or it can feel like laws and regulations and standards are not part of that whole framework, right? It's not bringing the service to you. But I think what we found throughout this, and probably what we both believe very strongly, is that this is the foundation upon which we will realize those rights, because it creates that, as you said, that framework for safety and security and strong workforce. And so that's, even though these laws and standards and technical regulations feel very kind of sometimes hard to understand and hard to grasp, and really kind of hard to understand why it's part of the whole ecosystem, it really is at the foundation of realizing access to water and sanitation. So why does the law matter? And as I said, law can feel very difficult to understand, right? It's a lot of words. It's often written in a very strange way, and it doesn't feel like that there's a link between law and actually getting access to drinking water and sanitation, right? Drinking water and sanitation are very tangible things. They're an actual substance. It's an actual mechanism, right? It's something that we use and drink. Law is not something that we drink. It's not as tangible. It's not as easy to understand, but it's really at the foundation of all of this. And also standards themselves. All of the laws and regulation, which to me is kind of a bracket term, is at the foundation of making sure that we have access to drinking water and sanitation now and into the future, but also that they're safe and reliable. And so what exactly does law do? It creates rights that you and I have. So it would create a right to water or a right to sanitation that would have to be protected. It creates other protections like right to a clean and healthy environment, or a prohibition on polluting the environment or discharging harmful contamination. It creates certain processes. So it would create a process to get a permit or an appeals process if your permit is denied. And then it also creates these institutions. So it creates the Ministry of Water Resources and Sanitation. It creates the agencies that are responsible for actually implementing these laws and ensuring that they're not only implemented, but enforced. So law plays this critical role in creating that foundation for action. It also, in a more tangible way, requires action, it allows actions to happen, and it prohibits certain things from happening. So it may say that you're allowed to do something, it may say that you're actually not allowed to do something, and it may say, well, you can do this, but you don't have to. And a lot of those are just instructions that are given to different agencies and to people like yourself and myself who are active. You might have an industry who does discharge contamination, and you will need a permit for that, right? So the law controls and oversees and protects citizens. And then there's really four things that you have to care about with respect to law. It's that there is law, right? So the law has to exist in some form. It's how the law is written. So how you actually create the rights and protections and processes and institutions matter. And I'll pull out some of those examples as we move forward. Then once you have that, right, the law still has to be implemented. So you can have we often talk about this in the sector, you can have this wonderfully written law, and yet nothing is happening. You're not seeing a change on the ground, and that's because the regulations aren't being written, they aren't being adopted, the standards aren't being written. There's certain things that aren't being done to actually put that law into practice. And then lastly, that law has to be enforced. So when somebody does something that they shouldn't, for example, if they put a product into the market that doesn't comply with the standards, but it's allowed to continue to be in that marketplace, right? Then that also it undercuts the law, but it means that there's an enforcement issue. So it's that the law exists, it's how the law is written, it's how it's implemented and whether it's implemented, and again, how it's enforced and whether it's enforced. So that's the four things that really matter with respect to law. So the big question that we answered was, do the existing laws in Zambia and Ghana and Uganda actually enable a strong NQI wash? And the very quick answer is they don't. But that doesn't mean that there isn't reason for hope, right? These countries are not the only countries that do not have that strong foundation yet. And we'll talk later on about certain things that can be done to strengthen that foundation. But at the heart of it, we ultimately found that those laws are not creating that enabling environment to really create that strong NQI wash foundation that we need. And there's two main findings. So one is that the national laws are just not creating that commitment to achieving access to water and sanitation. So we would anticipate that the laws would recognize the human right to water, and we'll get into the details shortly, but we would anticipate and expect that the law, as I've said numbers of times now, it creates that foundation. That's what we'd want to see. We just didn't see that commitment in the law to achieving access to water and sanitation. And then as that connects to standards, we also notice that the national law doesn't encourage the development of WASH standards, and that the WASH standards are not required to be mandatory by law or even within the standards regulations. So those are the two main findings. With respect to whether or not the national law creates that commitment to achieving water and sanitation, there were 5 key findings that we found within that, and 5 key things that we looked at. And so the first thing that we would have expected to see in national law in order to create that commitment is a human right to water and sanitation. And unfortunately, neither the Constitution nor the water law or the environmental laws of Ghana, Uganda, or Zambia create and recognize and establish that human right to water and sanitation. And that's an important starting place. It doesn't mean that you still can't create that commitment to NQI WASH. It just means that you have a slightly weaker foundation. And in part because that human right prompts really everything that follows, right? There's a number of different steps and actions that are to be taken if you're actually going to realize that human right to water. So having a human right or having a right to water and sanitation is that starting place. But the existing laws do not have that. The second thing we would look for is a prohibition on pollution beyond certain limitations. And we did find that. So national laws do say, hey, you cannot pollute, especially beyond these certain limitations. And those limitations have to be adopted in each of the 3 countries by a ministry that's been designated as responsible for establishing those effluent limitations. The challenge is that the law doesn't give a lot of guidance or create really that clear framework for actually managing that process and overseeing the reduction in pollution. So while there is that basic prohibition in place in all 3 countries that you cannot release contamination beyond certain limits, there isn't that clear framework. And you might be wondering to yourself, well, this isn't really related to the human right to water and sanitation. And it is. The reason being is that the more contamination that's in the rivers and all of your source waters that you're drawing to get your drinking water, the harder it is to provide safe drinking water. The more it costs, the more that you have to worry about the safety because there's more contaminants. And possibly there are even contaminants in the source waters that have been released by industries that we can't even treat for yet, right? Or are just really expensive to treat for. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about PFAS, right? That's an emerging contaminant that is of significant concern. That's very costly to treat for. So in terms of pollution, it's a critical part because it ensures that there's less pollution being dumped into the rivers that serve as the source waters for our drinking water. On the sanitation side, our untreated wastewater is actually one of the most concerning contaminants in our rivers, and that's in the United States, that's across the world. The wastewater, untreated domestic wastewater and industrial wastewater is one of the ongoing challenges that we face in terms of reducing contamination. So within this bracket, we looked at whether or not there was a prohibition, whether or not you had to apply for a discharge permit, whether or not the ministry has to adopt certain effluent limitations, and then whether or not there's a requirement to adopt water quality standards. So there is a prohibition on pollution. It's not a blanket prohibition, but you cannot pollute beyond the effluent limitations that have been created, of which the ministries are required to create effluent limitations. There's a requirement in at least 2 countries to apply for a discharge permit. So in Ghana was one of the countries that we saw that there isn't that requirement, and it's unclear as to what that process is based on existing national law. And then water quality standards as well, there are only one country, and that's Zambia, that actually requires the adoption of water quality standards. And again, this water quality standard complements the discharge standards or effluent limitations because it says, look, we've said that we're using this water body for a specific purpose, for example, drinking water, which means we need to maintain it at a certain quality level. That's what the water quality standard does. And so that sets a basis upon which to ensure that you're not discharging so much contamination that it can't meet that purpose. And so if you were to release so much contamination into a source water that it can no longer be used to source drinking water, that threatens access to water. And so that's why having those water quality standards in place is a really fundamental part of the human right to water, or simply just achieving access to water and sanitation. The third aspect that we looked at is whether or not national laws actually require the adoption of regulations to govern drinking water and non-sewerage sanitation. none of the three countries actually require the adoption of drinking water standards or of wastewater treatment standards. Uniquely, though, Uganda national law does in fact require the adoption of codes of workmanship for private sewerage installations, on-site sanitation. And that's a unique distinction that I wanted to draw out. Fourth, we found that only Zambia and Uganda actually require permits to withdraw water resources, and that only Zambia actually prioritizes domestic use above and against any other water uses. And the reason that this matters is because if you don't have drinking, or if there isn't water in your water resources, then you won't have drinking water. And so it's important to manage your water resources appropriately and ensure that they're not being overused, and that there will be sufficient water resources, especially in the midst of droughts, for to serve as a source water for your drinking water. And then lastly, data enables transparency. And so transparency and accountability are two of the remaining parts. If you remember at the beginning, I said part of law is implementation and enforcement. Well, access to data ensures that there's transparency and that there can be implementation and enforcement. It means that there's information available to make sure that people are taking the actions that they should be taking. And along with the fact that you'd have enforcement mechanisms. So we looked for enforcement mechanisms to ensure that if there was a requirement in the law to do something, so to apply for a permit or to not release contamination into the environment, that there was some kind of related enforcement mechanism associated with that. And what we often found is that in some instances there are enforcement mechanisms, in many instances there aren't. So without that enforcement mechanism and without a powerful enforcement mechanism, there's no incentive to actually comply with the law. So for example, and I'm forgetting the country specifically, but in one of the countries, there was a very small penalty that could be assessed if you were to violate your permit or to actually release contamination into the environment. I believe it was like 500, and they call it penalty unit. So it's whatever your currency is, but the law references it as penalty unit. So it's 500 penalty units that's it, right? $500, let's say, for releasing contamination into the environment. If you're a big industry, that's not much of a disincentive to actually release that contamination. And so that's also why in some areas you may see that even if there is an actual prohibition in place, that there is no compliance, because, well, an industry is more than happy to pay $500 because it'll save thousands by not actually meeting certain enforcement levels. So that was also one of the things that we expected to see when we were looking as to whether or not there was a strong NQI wash in these countries. The second half of what we looked at was whether or not national laws actually encourage the development of wash standards. So one is the foundation, right? Human rights, access to drinking water and sanitation. And we'll get into kind of more of why that incentivizes standards and how that connects. But that's the foundation. The standards themselves, that ensures that the services and the technologies and the infrastructure is actually safe, so that when you're being delivered drinking water through a pipe, that it's not poisoning you at the same time. And so we had several findings within that. First is that the standards bodies themselves are not actually required to develop wash standards. So there's no requirement in the law for any of the standards bodies in either of the three countries to develop wash standards. So it's a choice that they have. And in many instances, discretion can be a good thing, but here we were concerned that there isn't that impetus to actually develop those wash standards. When we did look at the wash standards that had been developed and adopted, we found that they weren't compulsory. So even where there are wash standards, they don't necessarily have to be complied with. So they may be in existence, but it may be that no one actually has to fulfill the requirements of meeting that standard. We also found that in the scope of wash standards, they're not comprehensive, and I'll leave it to Christopher to talk about that in greater detail, but we would anticipate there being standards about fittings and piping and other aspects, kind of the comprehensive picture of providing a drinking water and sanitation service, but they don't fulfill all of that. One of the things that we also noted is that lead and addressing lead in drinking water could really be an important catalyst for adopting other wash products. There's been a lot of focus and a lot of leadership within these countries to to adopt limitations on using lead in certain wash delivery products. And so that can actually serve as a reminder and a catalyst for creating other wash standards as a reminder of how important these standards are for ensuring that, as I said, these delivery mechanisms actually provide a safe service for public health and for the environment. And then lastly, I've used the word transparency in many different ways, but one of the things that I was also concerned about is that the process for actually developing standards isn't clearly defined. So there aren't rules in place that say this is how the standards are going to be developed and this is when they're going to be reviewed, right? Standards and our capabilities change over time. And so there should be some kind of review process in place to ensure that those standards also adapt with the times and recognize the advancements that we've made.
So this is a slide that I get very excited about. Back in September 2021, IATMO, with funding from the U.S. Department of Commerce, published a report titled Water and Sanitation Standards in Southeast Asia. This study focused on plumbing-related regulations in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And as part of the report, IATMO divided the work into two phases. In the first phase, IATMO did a careful review of international standards referenced in each of the countries' national plumbing and construction codes for water and sanitation systems. In the second phase, IATMO carried out a review of actual national technical regulations and explored whether the use of these national standards was mandatory or voluntary. It also identified whether any of these standards fell under mandatory and or voluntary certification or national quality mark schemes. The results from two of these countries, Indonesia and the Philippines, have been included in this slide, with results that are being released today as part of the Plumbing the Depths report. For this report, we were very excited that ANSI and Alexandra, with her work with the center, allowed us to include our work, expand on this work with the national standards bodies from Ghana, Uganda, and Zambia to identify national technical regulations in their catalogs of technical regulations related to wash products. We divided these products into three buckets. The first is fittings and fixtures, which includes items like hand pumps, faucets, sanitary products. The second bucket is piping. And the third bucket was water filtration technologies. The fourth column that you see there for each country is how many of these technical regulations have been mandated by a ministry with the authority to enforce it. Now, in a perfect world, we would expect a fairly balanced number of regulations across all three product categories, with the highest column being the number of regulations that are mandated. However, as you can see from the slide, reality paints a slightly different picture. Across the globe, we see that countries have taken the most interest in piping, and we were surprised to find out how few of these countries have actually taken action on things like water filtration technologies. This slide is helpful in illustrating the gaps and also the opportunities that exist to help formalize the product markets in each of these countries. Now, similar slides could also be created about professional qualifications or about how systems come together, the whole system as well. However, why is this important? And I think Alexander did a great job. But without laws and regulations governing wash products, markets become infiltrated with products that are unsafe and that are inefficient. Consumers have no way of determining which are quality products. And using materials that are available in the local marketplace for projects means that we're continuing to build new systems with known dangerous components. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we chose to pay particular attention to the governance of products, as we believe they represent one of the easiest entry points for action.
So on that note, there's a variety of recommendations that we developed in response to these findings with respect to the laws and the regulations, as well as the standards. And we've included 3 of, I think, 8 recommendations that we included in the report. So the first is that, as just a starting place, national laws should be amended to recognize the human rights to water and sanitation. As I said earlier, it's not a deal breaker, right? It's not that this whole house of cards collapses because there isn't an art human rights to water and sanitation, right? You could still achieve many of the benefits of having a human right to water and a human right to sanitation by taking other steps. But that's a starting point. It creates such an important legal recognition that you as a person have a right and that the government has a responsibility to realize that right. So it is a starting point for that, but also kind of all the way down the line. If you have a human right to water, then that triggers multiple steps. That there's a need for those products. There's a need to actually realize that right. And so one of obviously the very first recommendation is to create that human right to water and that human right to sanitation. And there are countries recently who have taken that step to do that. I would say El Salvador most recently is one of those countries that has taken that step. And there are other countries that exist like South Africa who have encouraged and who have included that within their constitution and their water laws. And I think there's some good examples there that can be looked at. The second recommendation is that national laws should require the development of drinking water quality and sanitation quality standards, as well as water quality standards. And the reason being is because, as Christopher said, right, the customers can't know what's safe if the drinking water is being delivered to them, there's an assumption that that's safe. But these standards ensure that they're actually safe. It ensures that the drinking water is safe to drink. It ensures that the sanitation, when wastewater is being released, or if it's on-site sanitation, that it is protecting the environment, that it's protecting public health. So having those regulations and those standards in place are really critical to protecting both public health and the environment. And then lastly, national laws should require the development of compulsory wash standards. With 2030 on our heels, we desperately need to take certain steps in order to ensure that we are going to achieve universal access to drinking water and sanitation. And having these standards in place is a critical part of that. Without that, the different mechanisms and the different technologies and the services and the infrastructure that is delivering these services can't be shown that they will provide a safe and reliable service. It's by having these standards in place that you're able to do that. You're able to feel comfortable as a customer buying a product in the marketplace, that you're confident that when that drinking water reaches your home, that it's safe to drink. That's the comfort and confidence that we get by having these standards and regulations in place. And so these are the three, I would say, main recommendations that we have coming from this report. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Atiya.
Yes, thank you both. That is such interesting research, and I recommend all the participants to review the document because the report is laid out in such a way that the recommendations are quite easy to digest. You may find some of the recommendations impact your own work. And I really appreciate the format, Alexandra, that you have written the report in because it is so easy to digest. So so if you haven't downloaded the report, you can also, besides in the chat function, use the QR code here. And please start thinking, audience, of some of your own questions you'd like to ask Christopher and Alexandra. It's such a great opportunity to have both of you with us to review the report together. So it is clear to see how the research can have important policy implications, And so I have a couple questions of my own I'd like to ask to get this discussion started. So, okay, I can't see the link. I will resend the link. It's widely acknowledged that access to clean water and sanitation is fundamental to human dignity and health, Alexandra, as you said. So could you elaborate more on why the rights to water and sanitation matter for national quality infrastructure?
So first and foremost, creating that legal right creates that need for wash products. So there's kind of this chain that I see and in my head when I think about how you get from the law to actual drinking water. When you adopt that human right to water and that human right to sanitation, and of course, this all depends on how it's written. As I mentioned earlier, there's one thing when you have a right, and there's another in terms of thinking about how it's actually written and how it's written in such a way that is tangible and meaningful and actionable. But when you adopt that human right to water and sanitation, you create a legal right and a legal responsibility. And so that means that the public has the right to drinking water and right to sanitation. And on the other side, the government actually has a responsibility to realize that right, to take steps to make sure that you do in fact get access to drinking water and sanitation that are safe and reliable, right? Because short-term access is not a success. We want long-term access over your lifetime. So that requirement to get the public access to water and sanitation, it then creates that need for certain products, right? Because I can't achieve the human right to drinking water and sanitation if I don't have something to get it to me. That's that it starts to connect that law to that tangible thing that we're talking about, that pipe, that fixture, that water, quality filtration system, right? That's the link, that I need those things to actually get drinking water from my home, or from the treatment facility, or from the river, if we really start at the point of inception, all the way to my house. And that then in turn, that right, having and creating and recognizing that right, it encourages people to get involved in that marketplace. It sends a signal to people like, hey, there's someone that actually needs this. So I should go out and maybe I can be innovative in this area. Maybe I can design a drinking water fixture that's going to help people. And I think we've seen that in different instances, but it creates that need and that desire to get involved in the marketplace. And then implementing those regulations and standards, they help to ensure that the goods and services are safe. So it's one thing to actually have that mechanism, but it's another to make sure that it's safe for human health. So if you have a lead pipe, of course, there are mechanisms by which you can potentially make it safe, but you're just not going to feel confident. I've talked to people, I've talked to families where they have lead service lines and they don't feel safe drinking that drinking water. They use bottled water as a result. So knowing that there is unsafe mechanisms, and of course, these are something that we've learned over time, but that's the importance of having a standard, and a changing standard that we adapt over time as we learn more about what's safe and not safe.
And if I may, I'll hop in here real quickly on this question of why human rights to water sanitation matter for NQI. What we have found in talking with many governments across the globe, is that frequently when you talk about industries where they're used to participating in the global marketplace, such as oil and gas, textiles, whatever the industry may be, they have robust regulatory frameworks. They have the laws in place that allow them, that provide structure for those industries, that allow them to participate in this, global marketplace, to exchange products and goods, that allows for the industry in that country to develop. However, when we start talking about water and sanitation, oftentimes they say, well, we kind of rely on community solutions, for those. We haven't developed, that industry yet. And so for us, there's this need to catalyze action in the water and sanitation space. And so, for us, we do believe that access to water and sanitation is a fundamental human right. And by legislating that right, it can serve as that catalyst that, as Alexandra's been saying, for governments and other stakeholders to begin working on some of these WASH governance issues. However, we also recognize that the political realities in certain countries can make such legislation impossible. And in those cases, we need to work to identify what other catalysts we can use to build political will with the institutions that are going to be required to take action. And sometimes that catalyst can be external funding. Sometimes it's simply helping policymakers connect the dots on how establishing these laws or these technical regulations are essential to meeting national performance, efficiency, or water quality goals. So I think for us, while we always like to begin with that, the law, legislating that right to to water and sanitation, we recognize there's also other levers that we can pull as well if that's not possible.
Great, thank you both. And Alexandra, you touched on this a little bit with innovation, but I'm wondering if you could discuss a little bit more how effective institutions contribute to accessibility and reliability of WASH services.
So it's kind of interesting to think about this, because the institutions like our ministries and even all the branches of government, they don't exist without law. This whole framework exists as a result of law. And it's kind of amazing to think about that. I sometimes forget that the reason that we have a ministry or an agency or a department or a certain branch of government is because it's been created and established through the Constitution and through existing laws. And so that's really the starting point. I mean, they exist because of law. And so if the law isn't written well, then the institutions may not be as strong as they can be. And I often hear working with stakeholders that, oh, well, we have the institution, but it's, we're not achieving the goals that we want to be achieving. And if you start to kind of unpack the list of responsibilities they've been given and things like that, you notice that sometimes the law is written in this very, the law has this very long list of what the ministry can do. So there's 78 things that the ministry can do, but maybe there's 2 things that they have to do. So, for example, I often saw language in doing this research that, the ministry could adopt certain regulations, that they could take this step, that they could adopt effluent limitations, but they didn't have to. And then even worse on top of that is that there was no guidance provided for how to do that. So if you wanted to ensure that there was public engagement in that process, or you wanted to ensure that those standards and regulations were reviewed over time, there was no actual process to do that. And there was no requirement on the part of the ministry to create or open up that opportunity. And so sometimes you start to realize that this is all being orchestrated by law, and you can realize why the institution is or is not effective as a result of that. And I would say that that's probably that difference between must and can is the biggest source of proof for why an institution will or will not be effective. Is that if there's a list of things, like as I said, 78 things that they can do and 2 that they must, then all this discretion is left to them. And they're going to prioritize, the agency or ministry is going to prioritize things based on maybe what is politically expedient for them, which may not be in alignment with what is important for public health and the environment. And so that, in terms of thinking about effective institutions, is really, for me, at the core. How strong is the law and how clear is the law in terms of what they have to do and what they can do?
And Alexandra, I think you raise a really interesting point there, because, and I think that's one of the values of the Plumbing the Depths report, is that it identifies the wide variety of institutions and government agencies that do play a role when we talk about kind of WASH governance. When we talk about regulating the whole systems, the people, the personnel, the products. These stakeholders include things like the national standards bodies, ministries of water, health, housing, commerce, public works, labor, or workforce. Depending on the product or the issue that is regulating. There's not one stop shop, right? That's going to provide all the governance for these issues. And I think also that through this report, it identifies where some of those opportunities lie in terms of, Africa's really at a unique stage for many of these countries, particularly in Ghana, Uganda, and Zambia, where they have a unique opportunity to begin harmonizing their governance processes, within the region. Many of these technical regulations right now are totally around products, particularly, are voluntary. And so these are relatively small markets. It's hard for quality products to be competitive, and it's hard to establish, the necessary supply chains. And so as they, and because their markets are saturated with these unsafe and inefficient products, primarily due to the lack of enforcement regulations and other processes related to these products. So lacking this formal definition, Ghana, Uganda, and Zambia have the opportunity to become leaders in the region, to begin formalizing their markets for these water and sanitation technologies, and then incorporating in, internationally recognized practices and standards. And I think by then you begin to build a really substantial market, and you help to develop those supply chains for, all water and sanitation systems in the country.
And Christopher, just to add on that, I appreciate your listing all the different ministries and agencies that can be part of this, because I think that list gives you an idea as to how complicated this is, and how there isn't necessarily a clear mandate yet within one institution who is required to oversee WASH. It's spread out across all of these different ministries, and that can also frustrate the effectiveness of institutions. And so I think that's also a critical part. And in the report at the end, there's this overwhelming annex that's been included, but it's a very, very detailed kind of the underlying assessment that we use to reach the conclusions that are included in the report. But there's a certain section that talks about all those institutions for each of the 3 countries and who's involved and what they do. And when you look through that, you know, besides, as it happens for me, your eyes glazing over, it's intense. It's really difficult to come to terms with the fact that there's 4 to 5 to 6 different groups involved at the governmental level in actually overseeing this. And then when you start to connect that to the other sections about who has what mandate and what they have to do and maybe can do, it gets you start to see some of the gaps very, very quickly.
Yes, and the annex is a great strength of the report. As you said, you've pulled out specific pieces of information from the deep analysis you've done with the mandates within laws and regulations as well. So I encourage the participants to review the annex. It's overwhelming, but not so in a way too, because you have your interests and your water utilities, you're in the ministries, you're in NGOs, you know what you're looking for. And the research questions have really been honed in so you can see what are the different aspects of how the recommendations and the wording in the annexes and what you can do from that to strengthen WASH NQI in your country as well. And a great fun question, what are some of the surprising findings you found? You've been doing this research for 2 years now. You've had in-depth conversation with stakeholders on the ground. And yeah, what shocked you about this research?
Well, maybe I'll start with a happy surprise. You know, we had for years heard anecdotal, data from received anecdotal stories and, got glimpses of data from these countries. And so through this report, we were really happy to see that the results that we had long theorized for each country, were actually, true, and they're kind of backed up by the data now. One of the key findings, as Alexandra did a great job describing, was that each country actually had an institution and processes where they really could, it allowed them to take action. Now, of course, many of them didn't have that, some of the enabling legislation and things that mandated that they take action. But theoretically, they could today if they wanted to. And that's not always the case. And so we were genuinely pleased to see that. Second, we were surprised that the findings, particularly as it came down to regulations of the product market, that they were consistent with our findings from our earlier study in Asia. That one, piping, when it comes to products, people understand, people can wrap their mind around piping and they understand that product category. And so those tend to have the most, regulations on the books about. We were surprised that across the board whether in Asia or now in Africa, that little attention is paid to water filtration technologies. Any sort of filters or anything like that, point of use, point of entry, water treatment trains, for on-site systems. And certainly I think that's particularly given some of the water stresses and challenges, that'd be something that we'd expect a few regulations on the books, kind of governing that product category. We were also surprised in some of the big gaps we found when it came down to fittings and fixtures. Basic things. Toilets, a faucet. There were gaps in for standards for some of these basic plumbing products, and and gaps in whether they were mandated. And just a quick point on that. So oftentimes, or it can happen where for whatever reason, whether at the request of industry or because of a need for procurement, a ministry goes to a national standards body and says, hey, we need a technical regulation for this product, whether it be a toilet, a hand pump, you name it. And so the national standards bodies develops that national technical regulation. Well, then the onus is on back to the ministry to actually begin to enforce that. And, without any level of enforcement or without the standard to begin with, it's impossible to stop, unsafe or inefficient products from entering into the borders. So it's hard. It's hard for them to be stopped from being sold, in retail and in commerce within that country. And it's hard, when projects are being constructed, to be able to identify, unsafe components and to be able to, pull them out through the enforcement channels. And so that's why, that's why it's one of the key questions we looked at, is whether a product technical regulation is mandatory or compulsory. And so, through this process, we did, while we recognize this is a snapshot, we also recognize that there's some additional questions and clarifications that need to be looked at and kind of in future areas. This was a very broad study that looked at everything from some of the enabling laws down to specific product regulations. And I think probably even any given one of these areas is worth kind of a deeper dive.
Yeah, I think just to add to at least from my perspective, one of the most surprising findings was honestly what doesn't exist in the standard space. I honestly had never really examined standards that closely. I knew that there were standards agencies that existed and I understood their roles, but I was unaware of I'd never really looked at the actual standards that they adopted, and I was surprised. I mean, especially when I was talking to Christopher and he was telling me what he's telling you, I couldn't believe what did and what didn't exist. And now that's a question I ask myself about here in the US and in other countries that I work in, because it's kind of that last, when I think about standards, at least, in terms of starting at the law, and then it's a last mile to a certain extent. It's like you've done let's say you've created the law, you've created the institutions, you've got the regulations, that's even thrown, you've got the financing to do all of this. If you don't actually have safe products, then it all collapses right there. And even though it goes back to the law, I think it's that those standards laws and standards bodies mandates are not as strong as they should be and not as clear as they should be. I would say something else surprising is processes. I think the more that I do this work, the more that I realize how important a process is and how important the transparency is part of that. And what I was surprised to find is that in certain instances, the process to develop a standard was described on the standards body's website, but then when you tried to find like what the actual details are and who was responsible for creating that and why it could be created like that and who reviewed that and who determined that that was okay, it was almost impossible to find information about that. And so when you start to think about, well, how does the public get involved in this? Like, where is an entry point for the public to ensure that these standards are safe, that they even know about them, right? Because creating that opportunity for public engagement to me is at least that little seed for ensuring that the public even understands this at all, that they know that standards matter, that they know that standards are important, and that they even know that the standard body exists. Because the more that they know, the more likely they are to expect to see, some kind of indication that the standards body has overseen it or that it complies with that standard when they're going to buy these products in the marketplace. And so not having those processes clearly required in the law or having them clearly laid out was another surprising finding. I think one of my last findings something that I was surprised and maybe not surprised at the same time is that our laws continue to fail us by not recognizing the human right to water. And that 2030 deadline of the Sustainable Development Goals is really creeping up on us. And at this point, I think there's a significant concern in the sector that we're not going to be able to achieve it. And I think that just really disappoints me. And it's as I've said numerous times, it's not that the human right and recognizing the legal right is the be all end all. There's so many other things you could do if that's just politically not something that you can get through. There's a lot of other things that you can include in the law to enable a greater realization of access to water and sanitation. But I think the fact that we continue to shy away from that is surprising to me. And my hope is that over the next few years that governments and the public become more comfortable with that we recognize that, frankly, the basic things that we need to survive are like food, water, and air, like just basic survival things to exist as a human being, and that we really should be protecting that. So not to go on my soapbox, but I think that's just a continuous kind of surprising finding for me that we're not making that leap to recognizing those rights. But I will end on a positive note that I do see little positive aspects throughout the laws, right? Like seeing that there's a prohibition on pollution and contamination, seeing that there are certain things in place to ensure that if you do pollute, that there are consequences. Even if it's not enough, it doesn't matter. At least there is a consequence. There are little signs of hope and things to build on that you can use that as a starting point to build out the law and strengthen it. So I think that's also important to note, that there are things to build on and things to improve, but it isn't like a huge gap that exists.
Right. As you said, the urgency is missing, but the research contributes to helping people find solutions for addressing that. And that's a great segue into my next question. There are several recommendations in the paper, and then you highlighted 3 with us today. What's the one takeaway recommendation you'd like to give us all?
Laws are instruction manuals. You know, I liken laws to the instruction manuals you get when you play a board game. You know, it says here are the rules for how you play this game. And I joke about the fact that, you know, none of us like rules. None of us like being told what to do. We hate having restrictions on us. It's just part of human nature. But it's also part of humanity that we need those guardrails and restrictions, just some kind of acknowledgement that there's a basic rule that we're all following, especially when it comes to sharing our natural resources and providing drinking water and sanitation, things that are just so essential to our existence as humans. So, you know, for laws being those instruction manuals, it's just important to invest in understanding what those laws say and invest in ensuring that people understand the rights and protections that they have, so that the people can get what they want from their government. You know, for me, that's a huge part of it, is that every group of citizens in every country should know enough about their laws that they can say, you know what, we want something else, or we want something better. We want better rights. We want a specific kind of right that creates this, or we want more protections in place that protect our source waters and our drinking water and ensure that our sanitation infrastructure is safe, that we have standards in place, that I can buy a fixture or a pipe in the marketplace and know I'm not going to be poisoned by it. So that public awareness is, I think, a really critical part for strengthening NQI WASH. The more that we know, and the more that you know, the better that these laws can be. And I saw a comment about the financial aspect to this, and I wanted to highlight that because I think that's also part of the importance in strengthening NQI WASH. Surprisingly, laws are also financing mechanisms. So I'll use the US as a good example. There are lots of mandates that we create in US law that we then don't finance. But we also have appropriations bills to finance or fund all the mandates that we've created. So we have unfunded mandates and funded mandates. And so the law actually it is a financing mechanism. And so I think of the fact that the law is still failing us by not funding that. It still shows a lack of commitment on the government's part when they're not willing to put the financial resources behind the mandates that they have or haven't created. And so, it is important. I can always bring it back to the law. And again, I'm biased as a water lawyer, but to me, that's another part of strengthening NQI WASH, that the more we invest in building out our legal infrastructure and creating rights and protections and thinking about how we should be protecting public health and the environment and recognizing the value of that, whether it is public health value or economic value, whatever you prioritize is most important, that at the end of the day, that value is always going to be shown. And so we need to make that investment in our laws and in our standards.
It's hard to follow out Sandra, after she, so beautifully preaches the water and sanitation laws and regulations and governance. The only thing I'll add is that, we recognize that governments have a lot on their plates. And I've yet to come across a government that wasn't interested in seeing their citizenry have access to clean drinking water and effective sanitation. With that being said, they have a lot that they're worried about and limited resources. And so I think as we look at all the targets that are presented in this report, it's important to start discreet and to start where you're at. We're happy to see like Ghana and Uganda, they joined to kind of the global lead-free partnership. They've recognized the dangers of lead leaching into their drinking water systems and have begun to focus on actions to address that issue. That's going to move the needle tremendously, for those those countries. We're grateful that Zambia has recognized the importance of skilled labor and actually require like plumbers and other professionals to be licensed. And so now they set up institutions to support those licensing requirements. And I think more can continue to be built off those efforts. And so I think it's what this report does. It gives a current state of play for each country and identifies where are there already small foundations being built that we can continue to develop to begin to complete the whole picture.
Yes, thank you both. And Christopher, building off of that, what are some of the international best practices, case studies from target countries? IATMO works globally. You have projects in many different countries. So if you could speak a little bit about some of the international best practices you've fostered and contributed to.
Sure, just a couple quick thoughts on that. We recognize when it comes down to regulating industries, products, government, people, the systems, it gets very technical very fast. And it can be overwhelming for an organization or even a government ministry that isn't totally fluent in these systems and processes. Fortunately, there are a community of international standards developing organizations that provide kind of the templates for countries, both at the national, provincial, even the local level, to follow. ANSI, you're a convener of many of those organizations, from anything from aerospace to water and sanitation to AI to you name it. There is a standards developing organization out there for it, and certainly and ANSI is a great place to connect with those types of organizations who have those expertise as countries begin to develop regulations and laws around this space. We're excited about the work that we've been doing in countries like Indonesia, where we've been able to work directly with, bilaterally with the institutions, government agencies there, to help them to adopt, standards related to anything from faucets to plastic piping, and begin to look at the enforcement mechanisms. Certainly, I think in Africa, there's been a lot that's been done at the regional level through the East African community, and actually what's been interesting is I think some of these countries have actually taken those regional standards and they have developed it, and we'd love to see more countries continue to be able to do that. We're starting to see more action on this in multilateral engagements. At APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation meetings this year, the United States hosted a day-long water forum, and this event was sponsored by the United States. It was co-sponsored by governments such as Australia, Canada, Indonesia, Japan, New Zealand, Philippines, Chinese Taipei, and Thailand. And the focus was to discuss each of the economy's efforts, how they're regulating their plumbing products, and they're identifying gaps, and to begin building an action agenda for formalizing their product markets. And we're going to see more of that continue in 2024. And certainly that provides a great template. The other thing I will add is that I mentioned earlier that Ghana and Uganda have joined the Global Lead-Free Partnership. And that whole effort about how countries can begin to take steps to eradicate lead leaching into their drinking water. It's a safety concern that most people can easily understand. And there's some very easy steps that can be taken to begin to regulate, and begin to monitor and assess that situation. And so as part of that partnership, and as the
Did we lose Christopher for a second?
There he is. He's back.
Sorry, guys. I just kept talking. There are some great resources out there, and it's just a matter of connecting, to those resources.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And participants, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. Please put them in the Q&A section. We have a first question from Kate. She says, when you say WASH standards are not compulsory, what do you mean? Oh, and I see, Alexandra, you're typing, but if you could share your thoughts.
Sure, I'll start. I'll kick it off. So when a WASH standard isn't compulsory, it means that it doesn't have to be complied with. So if someone making a product, someone making that product does not necessarily need to meet the requirements of that standard. Christopher, I don't know if there's if there's an example or anything else that you want to add.
Yeah, I can let an example of plastic pipes. For example, if you have a standard related to, or let's take, I guess plastic pipes is a good example because they also can contain lead. If you don't have a standard for that product, that means, basically that product market is being dumped on from other countries with safe and inefficient products. And for the average consumer like me, it's pretty hard for me to tell which PVC pipe would leach lead and which one is built to international standards and would not. And they also, beyond just even that, that contaminant issue, there's also and structural integrity issues, with these products as well. Can it withstand the pressures that it's going to be required to, and have the life cycles that are necessary? And so having the effect of having a national technical regulation mandated and enforced allows that product to be stopped at the borders, allows products to be identified that are being sold in the marketplace and removed, from commerce. It allows for, even into the inspection, the final commissioning of some of these systems for, again, unsafe products to be identified and pulled and to be replaced at that level, just through the enforcement mechanisms. Without that, you don't have those stop gaps, and that's where we see markets that get infiltrated with, unsafe and inefficient products, and the inability for consumer to tell the difference.
Great, thank you. Keep those questions coming. And from our webinar registration, we have a question. How best can we promote use of safe hygiene practices in developing countries? If you'd each like to speak to that generally.
It's a great question. And I will admit that one of the things we didn't necessarily focus as much on, despite the fact that we did use the term wash, is we didn't focus as much on the hygiene side, but it's similar, right? I mean, I would say when it comes to hygiene, similar practices, like even just having access, like immediate access to water is critical, right? If you're going to be able to wash your hands, you have to have access to water. So having that access in your home, or at least at a central point, community point, still not ideal, but at least better than having a long distance to get to that drinking water, is important. And having water that is clean, so that when you wash your hands, you're not washing your hands with something toxic or otherwise. I think that's very important. So to me, the hygiene part links in by it's the proximity to water, the frequency with which you can wash your hands, that is so critical. And what is by having these other laws in place, and by having laws that require both that the drinking water is available within your home and that it is safe to use, in essence, supports greater hygiene.
I can't think of a country that has has drinking water that's, relatively clean from, source point to, point of use, where these issues aren't addressed in their national laws and regulations. Now, no country gets a perfect score. There's always work to be done, and and this sector is dynamic. There's things you learn along the way that then need to be improved upon. But unless these issues are addressed, you never get sustainable water and sanitation services. And so I think, particularly as we think at big funding of big infrastructure in these countries, that the issues identified in this report ultimately need to be addressed to be able to provide sustainable wash services. So when a World Bank comes in and makes an investment, when U.S. development organizations, whether it be USAID or like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC has an interesting funding model, right? They'll come spend hundreds of millions of dollars in a relatively short period, 5-year period, in a country on a particular sector. And if they're not addressing some of these governance issues, what they've done when they leave is they've built some quality infrastructure, but they haven't provided a pathway for sustainability moving forward, for that country. And so that's where I think, hopefully this will help begin to inform investments, because to their earlier point, there are more financial resources needed to address these types of topics. And so, this begins to lay out a roadmap for how these issues can be addressed.
And Christopher, I want to add to that, because I think that's a really great and important point that you made in terms of the financing and the role of MCC and World Bank, but also the audience. Like when I think of the audience of this infrastructure, they have specific needs to fulfill. And at times these infrastructures are not built with their needs at the forefront. And so there are times in which, in some of the countries that we've worked in, we've heard about water and wastewater treatment plants being built that actually can't be put into operation because they can't reach their target audience. They can't reach the community because it's really the peri-urban community that needs access to drinking water, but there's no mechanism to get the drinking water from the treatment plant to that peri-urban community, let alone their individual homes. And so I think that's also when I was talking earlier about public participation, that even in funding mechanisms, like you need a mechanism to include the public in that discussion, especially when you spend these millions and millions of dollars on these huge infrastructure. It's just critical to include them and for them to say, hey, like, we can't take advantage of that, or hey, come look at my community. You'll see that you're not going to be able to deliver it in this way. So either you have to also bring up our community as well as build this large infrastructure, or we need something that's more appropriate for our circumstances and our community. So I was, as you were talking, I was thinking about that because it again makes me think of process and engagement with the community and how important it is that the infrastructure and that we're building is responsive to needs.
That builds well into Jacinto's question. How can we ensure good service delivery in a country where there are no standards or interventions for intervention in WASH and institutions? So you touch on that a little bit with the standards, collaboration as well, but ensuring good service delivery in general, how can that be achieved?
I'll hop in here. One of the things that we've seen and a little bit have been frustrated by is that unless we nationalize or start to institutionalize some of these, service delivery and in these practices that are being put in place around some of these countries, it creates this patchwork that isn't sustainable. And then let me give an example. So let's say in Zambia, you have donor A and implementing organization A who decided that they need to come up with this type of project delivery that meets their needs, for the geographical needs, the needs of the community. It's in consultation with the community, and it's a great project. So they decide they're going to build systems in a certain way, use certain types of products, train people to how to maintain, install, these types of systems. Well, in a separate region, in a neighboring region of the country, you have, donor B and implementing organization B who come up with a different pathway, to achieve kind of the same results, right? And then another region, same thing. And so unless there's communications between, these different organizations, and then having taking those conversations to like the national government where, there is that discussion saying, hey, in our country, based on our needs, we should really focus on 3 different delivery methods. And from that, we can begin to regulate. We can begin to say certain products have to be used for these types of systems. We can begin to train personnel that doesn't matter what system they're working on, they have the skill sets required to allow them to design, install, maintain those systems. And it's a nationally recognized certification. So it doesn't matter where they move in the country, that skill set is valued. And then that third bucket is the whole system. It does take the government also, in partnership with these communities, say, yes, these are the systems that we're going to go after and endorse. And we're going to build the processes for the products, the personnel to ensure that we have all the components that we need. And in our design of the system, we're making sure that it's, fit for purpose, and it, incorporates, it incorporates the pieces that ensures that it's, for quality delivery, both on the components and also in actually how it's being implemented.
We focused on national approaches, and I completely agree with Christopher that there should be a harmonization across the country. And actually, interestingly enough, we've heard through field work, we've heard of challenges that are faced by communities because certain products and certain delivery mechanisms are being used, different mechanisms are being used in communities that neighbor each other. So if one community has an issue, they can't turn to that community next to them. There isn't a harmonized approach to providing these services. And so we have heard of the challenges that are faced when there isn't that national level kind of standardization of approaches. With that said, if there is no national leadership on it, I think it's important to say that the local community should be empowered to take action themselves. And there's a lot that they can do. They can do everything that we've talked about at the national level, at the local level. If the national government isn't in a position or isn't interested in taking that level of leadership, then local communities they can adopt local laws that create certain protections. They can create certain workforce development programs. Of course, that is also recognizing that the financial resources and the capacity may be less at the local level. But again, local communities are empowered. There's a lot of expertise and knowledge that they have. And so I would definitely want to say that there are steps that they can take, that local communities can take in the event that there isn't national level leadership or interest in taking national leadership on this. And so you can focus on creating local laws that help to provide those protections that you would anticipate, that create certain regulations for pollution or for products. So there are steps that can be taken if, like I said, if that national level leadership isn't there.
Thank you both. If no further questions, we'll move to the conclusion. So from my end, I'd like to thank all the participants for joining us this afternoon, this morning. It's such a pleasure to share the research with you all, and I hope you'll review the report. And please follow up with us if you have further questions. We're happy to get in touch more and provide you with additional information on the recommendations and research. And thank you, Christopher and Alexandra. I know you've both put in a lot of effort, especially you, Alexandra, making the report easily digestible, providing specific solutions. It's really been a pleasure to work with you both. So I'll hand it now over to Christopher.
Well, I just want to thank, again, ANSI and the USAID for supporting this type of research on governance. It's been an important topic, and thank Alexandra and the center for allowing us to be able to contribute and to the findings and be able to contribute to the research. This is a very helpful tool for industry to have moving forward, and we're excited to be able to continue to build off this and actually making real change.
I too have to thank, USAID and ANSI and also ATIA for their leadership and their interest in this topic, because that's where it all starts. By taking that and having that interest in WASH is so critical, and in the legal and standards parts. That isn't necessarily a common theme for different organizers. So thank you to both USAID and ANSI and ATIA for managing us and supporting us as we've done this research. I also have to thank Christopher for all that I've learned about standards. It's been a really interesting journey looking into standards bodies and standards themselves, and I feel like I've been awakened in terms of things that I need to pay more attention to when we do legal research. In fact, when we do work in the US and in other countries, I focus a lot more on that part than I ever did, because it is such a critical part. As I said earlier, I do think it is that last mile. So I have to thank Christopher for not only teaching me, but coaching me and opening my eyes to this really critically important part of WASH. I think in terms of one conclusion that I would like to make is that, as I said in kind of the introduction, law is such a critical part of this, and it can feel very difficult to understand. And so when ATIA says that this is digestible, that means a lot. And I hope it's digestible for you. And Christopher and I are both happy to discuss the recommendations, discuss the findings, discuss the annexes with you in detail if you're interested. It's that important to us. For us, we see a future where we are just not going to be able to achieve the goals that we have in the WASH sector if we don't have this strong foundation. Without the laws, without the guardrails, without the regulations, without the standards, we won't have rights. We won't have the protections that we need, and we won't have the standards in place to feel confident when we are drinking our water. And when I think about the goal of this research, at the end of the day, I want every person, when they fill their cup with drinking water, I want them to feel confident that it's safe. I want them to want to drink that rather than going and buying a bottle of water. And I want them to feel like it's safe to shower with, and it's safe for their kids, and it's safe to cook with, and it's safe to wash their hands with. It's just that it's so important for human dignity to have access to drinking water and to sanitation. And so even though this is research and it feels very academic in some respects, and it feels very in some ways political, right? Because we're talking about laws and regulations and institutions that have their own policy priorities and that may or may not be, or may or may not include WASH. At the end of the day, what we're looking for, and I think I can speak for Christopher and Atia, is that we want people to have access to drinking water. We focus on these frameworks, we focus on these standards because we believe that without them, we will not have access to drinking water. And that if you do have access to drinking water, ultimately that may disappear without greater stewardship of our resources and greater stewardship of our water and wastewater infrastructure. And so, with that, we hope that this report is useful, is a useful resource for you, and that, we're more than happy to discuss the results with you. And we look forward to hearing from you. So thank you. And thank you again for this opportunity.
All right, well then, thank you all again, and hopefully we'll see you over email, and we will be following up with the report link again, and also the webinar information. So thank you. Bye to all.
Thank you. Take care.